some weird people are going to become Christians next 2 years.
Oh, and I agree with you. And I think we're already starting to see
I
that with the
agree.
Iron Hersey Alis and others, where we're seeing a resurgence.
Oh, I'm talking bigger.
Yeah.
I'm talking bigger. I'm talking some guys that people would never expect to go there. I think that's happening next 2 years.
So Patrick Bet-David had Wes Huff on his show, and they talk about who might become a Christian next. And could it be Joe Rogan? Could it be so many other people? Who knows? Let's get into it.
I think today, believe it or not, I think it's the season where a bigger Billy Graham's going to come that's using the tools. I'm actually very optimistic about the future. I'll make to you with us being here right now as well. I think some weird people are going to become Christians next 2 years.
Oh, and I agree with you. And I think we're already starting to see that with the Iron Hersey Alis and others, where we're seeing a resurgence.
Oh, I'm talking bigger.
Yeah.
I'm talking bigger. I'm talking some guys that people would never expect to go there. I think that's happening next 2 years.
No, I think you're right. And I think we're in a particularly interesting age where you had the new atheism with the Richard Dawkins and the Daniel Dennett's and the Sam Harris's. And I think we saw those seeds planted and they grew into dead trees. And people realize that if you tell individuals that they're just a product of time plus matter plus chance, that they have no ultimate meaning, then they're going to struggle in finding purpose and drive.
What do you think happened with Sam Harris? You think that's what it is?
No, I think the new atheism, as it was articulated in the early 2000s, was a movement that was largely motivated in print and was theoretical, but actually the practical implications were dangerous, and that people, even people like Sam Harris, have realized that they are inefficient to actually be applied in real life. And so that's why you see, I think, people becoming the quote-unquote spiritual but not religious, and the new age becoming far more popular than... I don't run into atheists in the, like, Richard Dawkins types anymore. I don't. I run into a lot of people who are into manifestation and meditation and Christ consciousness and all of this kind of esoteric, very vague. I want the things I like about religion, but I don't actually want to be held accountable to anyone or anything. I'm finding that more and more, and that's also empty. And so I think you're 100% right in that we live in a particular age where the clarity that's going to be spoken into the confusion, I think, is the truth of the gospel message and Christianity. Because ultimately, in what you were saying before, when you're looking at this meta-analysis in terms of, okay, well, where are the leaks? Where are the problems that we're seeing in terms of why, say, something like Islam is outgrowing us? Well, I think if you look at the Christian worldview, it's different than religions like Islam in that Islam spread largely by occupation, where Christianity was a grassroots movement because it looked at Jesus, the crucified Messiah, the Lord of eternity who stepped out of his throne into humanity in the second person of the Trinity in Jesus and then died the death that we deserve, and then said that your goal is to stand before the Father and hear well done, good and faithful servant. Faithful.
Amen. Yeah, and that's crazy to think about, that purposeless in society is sometimes at its all-time high. But people still don't want to surrender their life to some authority. So they say, of course there's something that gives you purpose and meaning. And of course there's probably some God. But is it the Christian God, the God of the Bible? Because if it is, then we have to submit to some authority and we have to go by their rules, which is essentially the same thing as atheism, because they don't have to submit to any authority.
Not influential, not... world shifting, not, everybody wants to have a presence online. No, it's you just need to be faithful, and you need to be a servant in that faithfulness. And God is going to do great things with that. God's going to produce the Martin Luthers and the Billy Grahams and these individuals who change the world fundamentally through faithfulness, not through occupation, not through militaristic movements, but if we're faithful to the gospel message, that's really going to...
You think Billy Graham was faithful?
Oh, Billy Graham is definitely faithful. Yeah. When we see these people, and I have slight disagreements with some of the things that Billy Graham believed, but ultimately you see a testimony of someone.
Like what?
I mean,
specifics? Is it like
no,
theological
it's
more?
very minor theological issues.
Like
I
what?
think. I think later in his life he became a lot more soft to things like universalism, and where he kind of was
Really?
more open to people not confessing Jesus Christ, but there being an aspect of they could be saved. And I don't think that's compatible with biblical Christianity.
I don't know.
I mean, talk about a guy who was faithful in his Christian witness, in his proclamation, was zealous. And I think, just because I'm saying you need to be a faithful servant doesn't mean you don't need to be bold. I mean, Paul was bold. His life was threatened. He was beaten. He was shipwrecked. He ultimately died for his profession of faith. So we don't need to be wallflowers. We need to be bold. We just need to make sure that we're doing, as I quoted before, that doing so with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience.
Yeah. So today, 2025, okay, we see some of the stuff that's happened the last 5 years. LGBTQ, totally fine. Hey, school, kids, transgender, totally fine. Hey, it's totally fine. Everything is like totally fine. Comparing today to when you read about the city of Corinth and how immoral it was, and you see many times a comparison being made of Corinth with the modern day Las Vegas or whatever, some of these other cities that we have in America. And of course, you don't know the definite question, and when I make this comparison, I'm just curious to know what you're going to be saying about this. What caused Jesus to, what was the level of immorality where God said, hey, man, we got to go handle this right now. And then he comes down and, wait a minute. Or is the world today at that level of immorality where God's sitting up there saying, I think it's time? So how do you compare today's times to biblical times, Corinth, that era?
Oh, I think the time period that we live in is much more emblematic of the early church in those first few centuries of its existence, in that you have a culture that was very much accepting of, say, promiscuous sexual ethics and idolatry, and was open to things and misrepresented and misunderstood Christianity fundamentally. In that, there was a common practice within ancient Rome called exposure, where if you had a baby and you didn't want it, you would put it outside the city gates. You would put it in the garbage dumps. And Christians were notorious for going and saving these babies. And so the Christian...
That's like their type of abortion. That's crazy. Just leaving them out for literally no one. But Christians would step in and take these babies. And that's what's so amazing. And most of them were women. Most of these girls, most of the babies that were left out were women because they didn't want a girl. They wanted a boy. And you can't say like the Christian religion is misogynistic or are sexist, because that's literally who are the people who are the majority. The majority of Christians were women, especially in the early church, because of that reason.
Grew in part because they were against this form of abortion in the ancient world. And so they would collect these babies and they would raise them. And a lot of these babies were girls, which actually meant that the early Christian movements became astatistically predominantly women, because a lot of these women, the little girls were exposed in this. Now, the society around them heard about these strange Christians who were talking about, with the Lord's Supper, drinking blood and eating flesh. And then they knew that they were going out and they were taking these babies from the garbage dumps. And so they started to develop rumors that Christians were cannibals. And yet, despite what is a pretty heinous accusation, complete misunderstanding of what's going on, Christianity still grew. And some of the earliest critics of Christianity referred to Christianity as the religion of slaves and women, because it gave agency to these groups that were marginalized within society.
So funny. The mob's been around always, and it confuses and gaslights people all the time.
Definitely. And Christians were accused of being atheists, A being the negative participle, and then theos meaning God, because they denied that the gods existed, and antisocial, because they wouldn't participate in the goings-on within society that were inherently religious.
Imagine being a Christian and be considered atheist because they didn't accept all the other gods going on. That's wild.
it's in this context that Christianity, grassroots, from the bottom up, eventually goes from 11 scared disciples hiding in an upper room when Jesus is crucified to fundamentally taking over the Roman world within, half a century, half a millennium. And it's because of the faithful witness of the Christians who were being persecuted and yet were still proclaiming Jesus as Lord and were fundamentally speaking into the society that they lived in with a message that overturned the norms because it gave people purpose. And ultimately it gave them truth. That the idea of God stepping out of eternity changes the paradigm. I mentioned Glenn Scrivener. He has this really good illustration where he talks about all worldviews are some version of survival of the fittest. I'm paraphrasing him here, but what he says is all worldviews are some version of survival of the fittest in that you need to do right, you need to think right, or you need to feel right. And Christianity is different in that the fittest steps down and sacrifices himself for the survival of the weakest. And that message, we just we're just over the Christmas season, right? The Christmas message of God becoming a baby and becoming vulnerable is both an example to us of humility and how we should live, but ultimately in worlds where might and power in a very abusive way are often seen as the way to go, Christianity subverts that. In that Jesus could have taken cues from, all the rulers of his day, of Caesar and of Herod, and later on during his earthly ministry of Pilate, right? He doesn't do that.
Wow.
He comes down, he humbles himself, he lives a life of a servant,
Amen.
And he gets murdered. And that changes the narrative. And then he rises from the dead and conquers sin and death. And so because of that, those 11 scared disciples are now willing to go out into the world and suffer persecution and beating and death for the sake of this message that ultimately spreads out through all the ancient world and gets us to where we are today, where we're talking about things like freedom.
Yeah.
And that's because of the Christian Revolution.
That is absolutely based. I 100% agree. The fittest sacrifice themselves for the weakest. That is literally Christianity in a nutshell. First of all, Jesus is the fittest. He's the most fit. And he sacrificed himself so that we all could be saved. And obviously we need to sacrifice ourselves. So I absolutely love that so much. I'm absolutely just so psyched to know that we have a God that sacrificed himself so that we can be saved and we can trust in him. And that's our calling, to go into all the world and preach the gospel, telling people all around the world that Jesus loves you. He sacrificed himself for you so that we could be saved. Romans 12:1-2 says, "And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your body to God because of all he has done for you. Let them be a living and holy sacrifice, the kind he will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing." So guys, I encourage you to trust in Jesus today. Know that he is good and worthy of praise. Guys, if you haven't decided to follow Jesus for the first time, I encourage you to click the link below. It will be the best decision of your entire life. It will walk you right through to decide to follow Jesus.